Hi, everyone. Welcome to WooStream, bringing Willamette to you with our latest session, a book talk with Professor Richard Ellis. This is a treat for me. My name is Joe Mello, and I'm actually a Willamette alum from the undergraduate class of 2005. And I majored in politics and studied under Professor Ellis, among others. And I will say he gave me the best advice that I've ever received from anybody. And it's advice I still give to my students today, which is don't go to law school. So you can talk to me more about that later. I'm currently, instead of going to law school, I'm currently a professor of political science, actually, at DePaul University in Chicago. And I'm appropriately enough speaking to you tonight from the land of Lincoln here in Illinois. So very excited to hear about this book. Our session will be a deep dive into Professor Ellis's most recent book, Lincoln's Last Card, The Emancipation Proclamation as a Case of Command. And this book was just released by the University Press of Kansas, which must add is one of the most esteemed outlets for presidency scholarship in the country, probably the world. And I'm excited to officially introduce you to the speaker, Professor Richard Ellis, who many of you probably know is the Marco Hatfield Professor of Politics, Policy, Law, and Ethics here at Willamette University. Joined the faculty in 1990 after completing his Ph.D. in political science at UC Berkeley. And he teaches a number of courses in the areas of American politics, including the presidency and the initiative and referendum process. He's written widely on the history of the American presidency and American political culture. And among his books on the presidency are Presidential Travel, The Journey from George Washington to George W. Bush, which I don't know if Ellis remembers, but I actually worked as a research assistant on way back when. And
hopefully you're in the acknowledgments.
Yeah, I think I am. Old Tip versus the Sly Fox, the 1840 election and the making of a partisan nation, and the development of the American presidency, which is now in its fifth edition, which is pretty remarkable, which comes out next year. So I'll turn it over to Richard, who's going to give us a great talk, and then we'll have a little time for questions afterwards.
All right. Thank you so much, Joey. What a treat to see you. And I can't see the rest of you, but I really appreciate you being here. The first talk I ever gave at Willamette University was more than 35 years ago, in February of 1990, to be exact, down in the bowels of Smullen, in one of my least favorite rooms at this university, the infamously windowless B17. And some of you no doubt had classes there, and you'll know what I mean. That was for a job talk. I was then a freshly minted PhD out of UC Berkeley. And my subject was Abraham Lincoln's presidential leadership, specifically his use of cabinet members as lightning rods. There weren't then, and there aren't now, a lot of new PhDs in political science who would think it's a good idea to give their job talk on something as unquantifiable as Lincoln's leadership. Fortunately, I was lucky enough to give that talk to what may have been the one political science department in the country where that was not disqualifying. And for that, I am indebted to Suresh Bald, Bob Dash, and especially Bob Hawkinson, who chaired that search. And it probably helped me too that Hawkinson had been my undergraduate teacher at UC Santa Cruz. It really is a small world. So there's something immensely satisfying about getting the chance now to return to the subject of Lincoln's leadership at a point that's pretty close to the end of my career at Willamette. And before I get started, I do want to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the book I'm going to talk about was made possible by a sabbatical from Willamette that I received in the fall of 2023. So if there are any board members out there listening or future board members, I want to thank them for approving that sabbatical and every other sabbatical that they have approved. Throughout my time, sabbaticals have played an indispensable part in enabling me to write books on a fairly diverse range of topics. And some of them Joey mentioned, but also like the Pledge of Allegiance and the Boy Scouts exclusionary policies. And I feel truly blessed to have been at a place that allowed me and encouraged me and invited me to take on new projects and subjects that I knew next to nothing about. I've just submitted, in fact, my last, what I assume will be my last sabbatical request, which, if it gets approved, will enable me to complete a book I'm working on now on the radical origins of the initiative and referendum process in the United States. And maybe we can do an alumni Zoom again when I finish that one, if I finish that. All right. So the book I'm going to talk about today is on Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. And it was written for a series called Landmark Presidential Decisions, launched by my sometime collaborator, Mike Nelson at Rhodes College. Published by, as Joey mentioned, University Press of Kansas, a press I've now worked with on 7 books. I think Joey's at 2, right? Well, they're both Kansas books. Yeah. So you got a little way to go. But so but lots of time. When Mike approached me about contributing a volume to this new book series, my mind immediately went to Lincoln. And from there, it was a short step to the Emancipation Proclamation. What could be more of a landmark presidential decision than the decision to destroy slavery? America's greatest president, his greatest decision sounded like a winning combination for a great, or at least a pretty good book. Okay, so we're all accustomed to thinking about Lincoln through the prism of presidential greatness. And he finishes atop virtually every ranking of presidential greatness that's been conducted over the last half century. This is the Lincoln that's familiar to all of us, I think, as the master politician or the political genius, as Doris Kearns Goodwin called him in her best-selling book, Team of Rivals. And my first talk at Willamette that I referenced earlier was also in that vein, I think. But the more I read about Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, the more I came to wonder whether political mastery was the wrong way to think about his leadership. Instead, I began to ask myself whether it might be better to think about Lincoln's decision-making less in terms of presidential greatness and more in terms of presidential weakness. And that thought, in turn, led me back to political scientist Richard Neustadt's classic text from 1960, Presidential Power, the Politics of Leadership, the premise of which is that the presidency is fundamentally weak and underpowered relative to public expectations about government action. As a graduate student at Berkeley in the 80s, I, along with every other student in American politics, read Neustadt's book. It was and remains the most famous and influential book ever written about the American presidency. And every political scientist, as I'm sure Joe can attest, can recite Neustadt's axiom that presidential power is the power to persuade. I have to tell you that the book didn't do a lot for me back then. I had a hard time seeing what all the fuss was about. Reagan's presidency, which seemed to be upending the New Deal regime, didn't seem particularly weak to me. One sign of how little I rated Neustadt's book is that during my first decade teaching the presidency at Willamette, I routinely left it off my syllabus. I started to have second thoughts about the wisdom of snubbing Mr. Neustadт after an unfortunate episode involving one of my finest students and now among our distinguished alums, Dustin Buehler, who many of you may know was Governor Kate Brown's general counsel and now works as special counsel in the Oregon Department of Justice. And if I told Dustin not to go to law school, I don't know that if I did, but if I did, he ignored me. And it's a good thing he did. Dustin was a finalist for the prestigious Truman Scholarship. And he drew a regional review panel that included a prominent presidency scholar who I knew, and also was then Willamette Whitman's college president, Tom Cronin. So Tom, seeing that Dustin had taken my presidency class, lobbed what I'm sure he thought was a softball question. What do you think of Neustadt's approach to the presidency? And poor Dustin had to confess that he'd never actually read Neustadt. An admission that was obviously an indictment of me, his derelict teacher, not him, but nevertheless, it wasn't the kind of answer that was likely to get him a highly competitive fellowship worth many thousands of dollars. Although a couple years later, Dustin did secure an even more, if less lucrative honor by breaking the Guinness World Record for the longest lecture after talking for more than 50 consecutive hours about the history of the American presidency, a feat he accomplished in Eaton Hall, I believe. Okay, so did my decision not to grapple more seriously with Neustadt cost Dustin the Truman Scholarship? Maybe not, but the thought did nag at me. And so the next time I taught my presidency class, Neustadt was in. And that required me to go back and read him again, more carefully this time. And to my surprise, the book spoke to me in ways that it hadn't before. This, I think, was during the Clinton presidency, late in the Clinton presidency, I believe. And it possessed depths that my younger self had not fully fathomed. To borrow from Mark Twain, the older I got, the smarter Neustadt became. All right, so I'm going to give you all a quick primer on Neustadt so you can understand why I think he's helpful in understanding the Emancipation Proclamation. So even though Neustadt's book has framed the way that political scientists teach the modern presidency for more than 6 decades, the book has had surprisingly little, I would say zero, impact on the way we study and think about 19th and early 20th century presidents. And part of this was Neustadt's own doing. The book stresses the difference in kind between the power problems in what he called mid-century conditions, which afflicted the likes of Truman and Eisenhower, who he was writing about, and the conditions governing the way power was acquired and deployed by presidents in earlier times. I think Neustadt sold himself short because many of his core insights and arguments have as much to teach about these so-called traditional presidents as they do supposedly modern ones, by which political scientists generally mean anything since FDR. What Neustadt identifies as the essence of the problem facing modern presidents, namely that formal constitutional powers are no guarantee of power, was also a fundamental problem facing 19th century presidents, particularly during the Civil War, where people were looking to the government and the president for action. So to illustrate presidential weakness, Neustadt began his book, paradoxically, with 3 cases of command. Truman's removal of General MacArthur in 1951 for insubordination, Truman's nationalizing of the steel industry in 1952, and Eisenhower's dispatch of troops to Little Rock in 1954 to enforce the Supreme Court's school desegregation ruling. So at first glance, each of these cases of command seems to belie the idea of weakness, since in each case, the president commanded and others obeyed. The general was removed, the steel mills were placed under government control, and the children were escorted safely to school. But Neustadt suggests that the appearance of presidential success is misleading because, and I'm going to quote here, In each case, the decisive order was a painful last resort, a forced response to the exhaustion of all other remedies, suggesting less of mastery than failure, the failure of attempts to gain an end by softer means. In Eisenhower's case, for instance, Neustadt notes that there were a few things that he wanted less than federal troops enforcing the desegregation of a Southern school. His resort to command was a consequence of his failure to persuade. Neustadt also emphasizes the way that commands, though typically a last resort, are ultimately, in his words, not last at all. Eisenhower's order to deploy troops to Little Rock, for instance, bought time, but in the final analysis, it didn't solve the desegregation problem, not even at Little Rock's Central High. Commands are often a last resort, but in Neustadt's words, they're almost always less than conclusive. All right. So Neustadt also emphasizes, and I'm getting close to the end of what I'm going to tell you about Neustadt, that command is costly. And in his words, rarely comes at bargain rates. As Neustadt explains, command, and I'm going to quote here again, turns out to share the character of all the softer measures they replace. They turn out to be incidents in a persuasive process where someone lacking absolute control seeks to get something done through others who have the power to resist. So when all is said and done, Neustadt writes, command is but a method of persuasion, not a substitute. Okay, that's enough Neustadt, enough political science. So let me get to Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. I want to say that this is it's obviously one of the most famous presidential unilateral edicts, but also, I think, one of the most misunderstood. So the most powerful myth about the proclamation is that Lincoln freed the slaves with a stroke of his pen. And that mythology deifies Lincoln as the great emancipator and is part of a narrative of American history centered around the heroic deeds of our great presidents. In this narrative, the Emancipation Proclamation sits at the pinnacle of presidential achievement, the noblest deed of our preeminent president. Okay, the heroic mythology, which I think is familiar to all of us, competes with a more jaded view that the proclamation was much ado about nothing, a largely hollow gesture that freed no slaves at all and lacked even a moral indictment of slavery. On this telling, Lincoln was at best a pusillanimous politician, a follower and not a leader of public opinion, was the way Richard Hofstadter put it many years ago. Or at worst, a racist at heart who thwarted emancipation at every turn, being forced into glory, as Leonard Bennett suggested many years ago. As radically different as these two interpretations obviously are, they share an important assumption about presidential power. Both interpretations see the presidency in the hands of the right president as an institution of unbounded strength and transformative powers. The one sees in the proclamation the realization and validation of the presidency's immense unilateral powers, and the other sees it as an inexcusable failure to harness those vast powers of command, to lead the fight for social justice. The triumphalism and the disappointment are both reflections of a shared faith in the promise and power of the unilateral presidency. And it's here, I think, that Neustadt is most helpful in thinking about Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. By beginning from Neustadt's premise of presidential weakness, I think we're better able to understand and appreciate Lincoln and the proclamation. Telling the story of the proclamation as a tale of presidential weakness and of the failure to persuade is not to deny the proclamation's importance or to minimize Lincoln's skills as a leader. In fact, my hope is that viewing Lincoln's leadership through Neustadt's lens can produce a more realistic appreciation of Lincoln's accomplishments, which can help to inoculate us against the kind of naive cynicism that dismisses Lincoln without appreciating the constraints on his leadership. That we are ill prepared to think about Lincoln in terms of the failure to persuade is perhaps in part because we know that no other president had Lincoln's way with words. His most well-known lines are etched in our cultural consciousness, so that if any president should possess the power to persuade, it's Lincoln. But the Emancipation Proclamation is fundamentally a story of the failure of presidential persuasion, because the last thing that Lincoln wanted was a unilateral proclamation of emancipation. When General Fremont, the military commander in Missouri, issued his Emancipation Proclamation early in the war, in August 1861, Lincoln was appalled. He regarded Fremont's act as a political disaster, thought it would accomplish nothing toward liberating slaves in the states in rebellion against the US, while it could cripple the Union war effort by alienating the border slave states that had remained loyal to the Union. But because Fremont's act was popular among Northern anti-slavery constituencies whose support Lincoln needed, Lincoln sought to persuade Fremont to rescind the order rather than to have to rely on command. But he couldn't get Fremont, who's ostensibly his subordinate, to budge. And so Lincoln was compelled to resort to command to overturn the order, and at significant political cost, just as Neustadt would predict. Lincoln's preferred plan, the object nearest to his heart, is the way his assistant John Hay described it, was to persuade the border states, Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, to endorse gradual, compensated abolition, preferably coupled with the voluntary colonization of freed slaves. That is, so slaves would leave the US. Lincoln believed that would be better for the nation because it would shorten the war, minimize social disruption, create broader acceptance of social change. It would also be less vulnerable to the legal challenges that he thought unilateral emancipation would inevitably invite, particularly once the fighting was over. At the time Lincoln became president, the entire Supreme Court was appointed by Democrats. That changed quickly. The problem, however, was the more Lincoln pressed the border states, the greater their resistance to the idea became. The same was true of his efforts to persuade Blacks to voluntarily leave the country. And in the book, I spend quite a lot of time showing that it's only after being rebuffed time and time again by the border states in his efforts to persuade, cajole, to adopt his preferred plan, of gradual compensated abolition, that Lincoln finally, and with the greatest reluctance, pivots to that painful last resort, in Neustadt's words, of the Emancipation Proclamation, or as Lincoln put it, his last card, hence the title of the book. Okay. However, when Lincoln finally makes up his mind to play that card in the summer of 1862, he finds that he lacks the political support within his own executive branch to do it. He was persuaded by his cabinet to delay announcing the proclamation until he's in a stronger political position. So in the end, he doesn't issue the preliminary order until the end of September. On the day before, the 60-day clock that Congress had mandated in the Second Confiscation Act was about to expire. That act, which Lincoln had signed only reluctantly, stipulated that rebels must relinquish their arms by September 24th or face confiscation of all their property, including their slaves. The same act also said that any slave in the Confederate States coming within the Union Army control would be, quote, forever free. It was Congress then, not the president, and certainly not the president acting alone, that made emancipation in the rebellious states the de facto policy of the federal government. In issuing the preliminary proclamation declaring slaves in the Confederate States free, Lincoln was complying with the will of Congress more than he was asserting his own policy. Similarly, in the final proclamation, which is announced on January 1st, 1863, in which Lincoln approved the enlistment of Black troops, he was following the path marked out by Congress, specifically in the Militia Act passed in July of 1862, which allowed the president to enlist, quote, persons of African descent in any military or naval service. That same act also removed the words free and white from the qualifications for military service, which cleared the way for Lincoln's order. So the delay in issuing the proclamation also highlights the way in which public opinion constrains the unilateral executive. In deciding to issue the proclamation, as well as in the framing and content of the proclamation, Lincoln paid close heed to what he thought public opinion would support and how he thought other political elites would receive the order. Lincoln was keenly aware that it would do him little good to issue a proclamation that lacked adequate popular support. Lincoln never believed those who assured him, and there were a lot of these folks, that issuing the proclamation would transform public attitudes about slavery and rally the nation behind his lead. He never believed that was true. Lincoln's political weakness is perhaps nowhere more obvious than what he left out of the Emancipation Proclamation. Fearing that the proclamation would be vulnerable to legal challenge at the federal and state level, and perhaps in the court of public opinion too, he resisted efforts to get him to place the Emancipation Proclamation on what those pleading with the president called the, quote, high moral ground. He did, in the end, relent to call the proclamation an act of justice, which were Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase's words, not Lincoln's. But that was as far as he felt able to go in the proclamation. Nothing screams presidential weakness more loudly than Lincoln's need to forswear the so-called moral grandeur that generations of critics, starting with Richard Hofstadter, have never tired of lamenting. One can't emphasize enough the weakness of Lincoln's position at the close of 1862. The war continued to go extremely poorly, and the mood in Congress was dark. Congressional Republicans were inundated with criticisms of the administration's handling of the war. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner was told by one correspondent that Lincoln's resignation would not only be, and I'm quoting, received with great satisfaction, but might avert what will otherwise come a violent and bloody revolution at the North. Only days before issuing the final proclamation, Lincoln met with Sumner, who was urging the president to stand by the proclamation, and Lincoln's reply is revealing. He told Sumner he could not stop the proclamation if he would, and would not stop it if he could. The latter part reflected Lincoln's conviction that the proclamation was now a military necessity and that it was the morally right thing to do. But the first part spoke to Lincoln's recognition that politically he had no choice but to stand firm and issue the proclamation. Failure to do so would have made him appear weak, and Congress, which was already a center of anti-Lincoln agitation, would have deserted him entirely. He would have become a president without a party, with no prospect of re-election. The weakness of the presidency is also lying in plain sight in the famously limited scope of the proclamation. The common complaint that it freed no slaves because it applied only to those areas of the Confederacy where its effect could not reach shows how constrained Lincoln's power of command was by his need for the support of other political actors. Unilaterally emancipating slaves in the border states was never really a viable option because few people believed he possessed that power, and it risked pushing those states into the arms of the Confederacy. Lincoln could, in the proclamation, have refused to exempt Tennessee, West Virginia, and a handful of counties in Louisiana and Virginia from the proclamation, but he opted for bargaining rather than command because he thought, probably correctly, that the war effort would be more successful and the proclamation more effective by securing the political support of the political leaders in those key areas, including Andrew Johnson, who was then the military governor of Tennessee. Moreover, like most unilateral executive actions, the Emancipation Proclamation was, in Neustadt's terms, a less than conclusive order. The proclamation was inevitably less than conclusive because, as historian James Oakes has shown in his great book, which I highly recommend, Freedom National, American slavery was a vast empire, by far the largest slave society in the world, possibly the largest in the history of the world. It was numerically huge, territorially vast, and even the Union Army, with 700,000 soldiers at its peak, lacked enough men to physically reach and emancipate more than a fraction of the slaves. When Robert E. Lee surrendered in April of 1865, something like 86% of the Confederacy's 3.5 million slaves were still enslaved. Lincoln understood early on that the proclamation's effectiveness in ending slavery depended on Union victories on the battlefield and Republican victories at the ballot box. But what he and other Republicans increasingly came to realize was that Union victories and even Lincoln's re-election were no guarantee that slavery would be destroyed, no matter how extravagantly the Emancipation Proclamation might be praised. It couldn't do the crucial work of uprooting slavery from American soil. No presidential edict could achieve that. Instead, the destruction of slavery required, of course, the passage of the 13th Amendment. There was no inevitable, irrevocable logic that led from the Emancipation Proclamation to the end of slavery. Without Republican victories in the presidential and congressional elections of 1864, and without the Union's defeat of the rebels, slavery would have remained entrenched throughout the South, and many of those freed by the proclamation would have been enslaved again. The president's proclamation, in short, was neither the beginning nor the culmination of the wartime effort to end slavery. So the important takeaway here is that we need to look beyond the singular act of a single man to the many congressional statutes, state actions, cabinet members, and advocacy groups that contributed to the destruction of slavery. Such a reading of the proclamation not only highlights the groups that pushed and sometimes forced as well as enabled Lincoln to act, but also invites us to take a more critical lens to the heroic narrative of Lincoln as that master politician, possessed of an unerring sense of timing, who almost from the outset of the Civil War maneuvered skillfully to make it a war of emancipation. Lincoln was not playing four-dimensional chess, nor was he running rings around the spinning heads of lesser politicians. During the first 2 years of the war, as historian Eric Foner points out, Lincoln, and I'm going to quote here, succumbed to wishful thinking about the extent of Southern Unionism, the willingness of border slaveholders to accept any plan of emancipation, and the receptivity of Black Americans to the fantastic scheme of colonization. The timing of the proclamation, moreover, was far from shrewd. By issuing the proclamation suspending the writ of habeas corpus immediately after announcing the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, as another historian, Mark Neely, has written, Lincoln, and I'm going to quote here, allowed his critics to label his act of liberation as a part of a pattern of despotic rule. And by issuing both proclamations only weeks before the start of crucial fall elections in the fall of 1862, Lincoln handicapped his party in key state and congressional races and contributed to the Republican Party's stunning defeats. Between the summer of 1862, the preliminary proclamation, and January of 1863, the final proclamation, Lincoln's equivocal public statements about emancipation arguably did more to confuse the public, demoralize his supporters, and harden opposition than they did to prepare the ground or rally support for the Emancipation Proclamation. Certainly, Lincoln consistently failed to persuade others to support his preferred policy of gradual emancipation paired with compensation for slave owners. Lincoln's failures and missteps in some were at least as notable as his successes. In fact, Lincoln came very close to being a failed one-term president. At the end of the summer of 1864, only a few months before the general election, Lincoln's public support cratered as the Union's military efforts seemed to stall, and panicked Republicans who thought Lincoln was sure to lose to McClellan in November mounted a desperate effort to dump Lincoln from the ticket. In the middle of August, Thurlow Weed, who's the savvy New York politician, he told Lincoln that his reelection was, quote, an impossibility. And Lincoln's good friend, Leonard Swett, said that his reelection was beyond any possible hope. Lincoln himself was equally pessimistic about his chances, telling his associates that unless some great change takes place, he would be badly beaten in November. Fortunately for him and the Emancipation Proclamation, the Army's fortunes did turn around in September. Lincoln may not have been a political wizard, but he was, in the end, lucky. And as they say, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. Lincoln's great virtue, however, One not generally appreciated by his critics was his keen appreciation of the limits of unilateral action. He was decidedly more sophisticated than the legions of impatient advocates who insisted that he could instantly abolish slavery with the stroke of his pen. Unlike, say, Sumner, he never assumed his powers as president were, as Sumner described them, godlike. He knew that a president's power was limited, and unlike the famous newspaper editor Horace Greeley, he never entertained the fantasy that declaring every slave in the Confederacy free on the day he was inaugurated would have made those slaves free. He understood that the efficacy of a proclamation depended on far more than his own volition. As much as Lincoln suffered from wishful thinking throughout 1862, overestimating his persuasive powers and underestimating the tenacity with which border states would cling to slavery and blacks would resist colonization, he understood that he needed to build support for his Emancipation Edict for it to be successful. It did no good to command if the people weren't going to follow. Lincoln's clear-eyed understanding of the limits of command helps to explain why the Emancipation Proclamation was a last resort. Lincoln was loath to rely on a unilateral directive, not only because he was convinced that his plan of congressionally authorized, gradual, compensated emancipation was ultimately better for the country, but because he recognized that an Emancipation Proclamation was not the trump card that some believed. Perhaps better than anyone, Lincoln understood that declaring slaves free would not make them free, let alone equal citizens. By deifying Lincoln and canonizing the Emancipation Proclamation, the mythology of Lincoln the Emancipator does a civic disservice to all of us by teaching citizens to look to the president and his unilateral powers for easy solutions cast in bold, dramatic strokes. In effacing the complexities of history and politics, the myth nurtures a presidency-centric view of our politics that stokes unreasonable expectations about what can be achieved through unilateral action, thereby inviting a corrosive cycle of disillusionment as contemporary presidents fail to measure up to the impossible myth of unilateral presidential deliverance. And maybe most dangerously, in this particular moment, it encourages us to deliver ourselves up to a president who offers to single-handedly save us from our many afflictions and divisions. Ironically, this mythology of Lincoln obscures one of Lincoln's most profound insights, that unilateral action is no substitute for the laborious work of politics, of winning elections, mobilizing supporters, cajoling doubters, bargaining with peers. That presidential power, in short, is indeed, as Neustadt taught, the power to persuade. Okay, that's it for me. Thanks so much for listening. And Joey, I'll let you handle.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much. That was amazing. I will say you're lucky you're in Oregon, not Illinois. You can't talk that much bad about Lincoln out here. You'll get in trouble. We're going to do Q&A here in a minute, but I'm going to exercise moderator's prerogative and ask you a couple questions if that's all right. So I do want to know what you think about Trump and how this applies to Trump for sure. But I did want to ask a question about Lincoln too. And I know you said you're not a Lincoln expert, but I think your argument that Neustadt just doesn't get applied to these 19th century presidents is a really good one. Like, people like Lincoln are kind of a good example, but I think in some ways Lincoln is sort of an easy pick for you because he acts like a modern president, in part because the Civil War is going on. So I'm wondering if the fact that Civil War is going on is forcing Lincoln to act more like a command president and be less persuasive. And if that makes him maybe sui generis and not like generalizable to these other less modern presidents in the same way.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, first of all, Neustadt acknowledges in the book that Lincoln is maybe an exception. It's one of these buried little remarks, because the key for Neustadt is the expectations. What are the expectations of the president? That's what drives presidents to. That's the problem. Otherwise, it's less of a problem if all you're doing is handing out patronage. So yes, and Neustadt acknowledges that, and so it's surprising that neither Neustadt nor any of his students ever went and looked at Lincoln. But I am skeptical, because I feel like modern political scientists, and this is something I've written about a lot in other works, and my presidency text is sort of the way of doing this, is that there was a lot more leadership going on in these traditional so-called presidencies, and presidency scholars have just sort of lopped it off. And so we'll just do FDR on, because that seems familiar. There's public opinion polling and whatever. But I do think there's often more to be learned from these older presidents. And I think if you were to look at Polk and Washington, I'm not going to do it, but
Jefferson,
somebody out there wants to do it. I actually think the Neustadt lens is a good one.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think it's just like, I mean, I don't know if they're budding political scientists, but it's a great example of how to do really great social science work. You take an existing core theory, you apply it to different stuff that hasn't been applied before. I'm shocked no one's done this before. There's so much low-hanging fruit out there for people to pick off. Anyway, if you're any grad students here who need a dissertation. So I guess, I do want to know, like, so is Neustadt still relevant? Obviously, we have a president now who doesn't seem to be in a persuasive mood, and uses command a lot, and it seems to be working, unfortunately, or whatever. I don't want to bring that in, but yeah. So what's your take on Trump?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's the question I get most often, is that question. From the occasional emails I get from readers, which are kind of nice. It's like, hey, so I don't have a great answer. So this is like my preliminary thoughts on this, I guess. The first thing I would point to is, in thinking about, is there's a part where Neustadt writes, his assumption is that and I'm going to quote from Neustadt here, the president has too small a share in nominating congressmen to erase their constitutional separation. So one of the things that I think is distinctive about Trump that makes him different, not just from 19th century presidents, but other modern presidents, is he's managed to erase that he doesn't have too small a share in nominating members of Congress. The members of Congress act as if Trump comes out against them, they're going to lose. And so all of a sudden, this sort of core assumption that Neustadt has about the way the American political system works kind of collapses. I guarantee you that if Harris was president, Neustadt would seem a lot more relevant. And it's not a coincidence that I wrote this book during the Biden presidency, and in the back of my mind, the Obama presidency, and people saying, why don't you just do this? Why don't you declare this? As if they do have a magic wand. But the things that it's so striking about Trump, because if you can imagine even just a small portion of what Trump has done being done by a President Harris or President Biden, they would have been impeached and removed by now. So clearly something is different. And I think that the connection between the president and Congress that has been true and sustained separation of powers, which is the president, even the FDR tried, couldn't control that, couldn't purge members of Congress. But I also think, and I do want to add this piece in, that the idea of a unitary executive, what I would call the myth of a unitary executive, the idea that the president So, it was intended to command and control all the executive power. I think conservatives' success in making that a legal and constitutional reality changes perhaps considerably what a president can do without persuasion, at least if they're a Republican president.
That's what I was going to say.
I don't think a Republican
for everyone or
Supreme
just
Court
them?
would be doing the same thing. But Neustadt assumed a world in which bureaucrats had to be bargained with because they had independent bases of authority that were protected by statute and by relations with members of Congress, and also by their professionalism and expertise. And in some ways, it was even more true of the post-Watergate presidency that came after Neustadt wrote, which shored up protections for bureaucrats through whistleblower protections and inspectors general, and also in the case of the Justice Department, which involved building up norms, protecting the independence of the department from the president. And so in endorsing the unitary executive, it seems to me, although it's far from the founders' understanding, that's another talk for another day, but the court has in a way elevated command over bargaining. Ironically, the whole point of Neustadt's argument and the context in which that argument emerged was that there were all these folks who focused only on the kind of the constitutional text. There were all these scholars. They didn't really look at how power was exercised. They looked at what Neustadt called the literary forms of the Constitution, and that those were no guarantee of power. But the conservative agenda since Reagan has really been to squeeze power out of those formal powers, particularly the so-called vesting clause. The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. That clause is trying to turn that into power. Right. It's sort of the anti-Neustadt. It's why they hate Neustadt. Bill Barr accused Neustadt of what he called mushy thinking for defining American government as separate institutions sharing powers.
Yeah.
So there are definitely some ways that he's not relevant, but let me just say a couple of ways in which he is still relevant, even in the Trump presidency. Okay, in a sense, you can say Trump's reliance on executive orders can be seen as a sign of weakness in Neustadt's sense. In other words, he's compensating for his inability to persuade by resorting to command, and that he's doing it when Republicans control both houses of Congress and he has a friendly court underscores that point, I think. Many of his executive orders, the Times columnist I was just seeing, maybe I saw it on Blue Sky, I think, Jamel Bowie, and he put it that many of the executive orders have the legal force of a child's wish list for Santa Claus. And Trump can sign an executive order saying there shall be no more vote by mail, but he doesn't have the power to do that by edict. Now, he could lead a movement to do that, but he can't just do it. It reminds me of Lincoln's comment to these two Chicago clergymen that I quote in the book, but what good is it to issue a document that the whole world will see must necessarily be inoperative, like the Pope's bull against the comet? It's like,
and apparently you can violate the Posse Comitus Act without even when a court tells him he can't. And,
But there's a book which I want to recommend to people called "Phantoms of a Beleaguered Republic" by Steve Skowronek and John Dearborn and Desmond King. And one of the things they say in there that's kind of interesting, it's about the deep state and the unitary executive and the way they feed off each other. But they say effective political leaders will have no need for the theory of the unitary executive, and the theory will not compensate for what leadership alone can provide. And I think that's a very Neustadtian idea. Effective leadership means building enduring coalitions that can remake the political order. And Trump, unlike, say, FDR, shows little sign of being able to build an enduring political coalition, enlarged coalition. Of course, and this is, I think, one of the key points. The assumption here is that what effective leadership means is making the existing political and constitutional system work better. But what if the goal is less about creation than destruction? Then maybe Neustadt doesn't apply, since breaking things is much easier than building things. Neustadt is writing with the assumption that a president is a small d democratic leader operating with a certain degree of self-restraint. And in the context of powerful, unseen, constraining norms. And I guess I would say, if, or to the extent that Neustadt doesn't apply, that itself is a sign of the extent to which we're on the path from democracy to autocracy. That Neustadt assumes democratic leaders who are actually trying to make government work. And that may be the assumption that doesn't hold here.
Only for one party, it seems, right now. Yeah. Well, as a legal scholar, I think you're right. So,
I was going to say there, Ezra Klein had an interesting op-ed in the summer that he talked about the way in which Trump was pursuing a strategy that forces you into overreach. You keep flooding the zone, you keep acting, you keep moving, you keep creating new cycles, and then you overwhelm yourself, and then there's only so much you can do, though, through these executive orders. So soon you have to go beyond what you can actually do. And when you do that, you trigger a constitutional crisis, or, he says, you reveal your own weakness. And I think you can do both at the same time. I think in that way, it's a false dichotomy. You can both reveal your weakness and trigger a constitutional crisis at the same time.
I want to hear you just talk to me about Trump and TR and Andrew Jackson. Sorry. We have some good questions in the Q&A. I mean, I just want to read. I love from Brack and Kilpack. When will Professor Ellis send us the paper assignment where we have to write a 2,000-word dialogue between Neustadt and Lincoln about when they meet for coffee and dessert and dinner to discuss the powers to persuade? Which I do feel like is probably a prompt I got from you.
Maybe I should use that in my.
You probably will.
Bring presidency class. I like that.
Could you clarify executive orders and proclamations? Are those basically the same thing, or how are they different?
Yeah, executive orders and proclamations are both species of unilateral directives. So they're presidential memorandum. They come in all forms, and there's not really it's possible to distinguish them. Some of them get, published in certain places, register, and so forth. But basically, it's up to the president whether they're going to be a memorandum, an executive order, proclamation. In general, the idea is that executive orders are directed to the government. They're directed to the federal government. You should do this. Proclamations are, in general, directed to the outside of the government. That's generally the way it's considered. But as you can see from a lot of Trump's executive orders, they're not really ordering something that the government has the power to actually do.
Yeah.
So there's not as much that distinction is often semantic.
Right. There's a question about just some of the internal politics going on with the Republican Party that were maybe behind the decision making that Lincoln was doing. I don't know if you want to talk about any of the strategic calculations that he might have been making in terms of like other people who might have tried to. I mean, I know he had rivals for the presidency even going on, stuff like that.
Right. I think the most important point, without getting too down to detail, because I know we're running out of time, but I think the main point is that Lincoln tried pretty hard to situate himself within the middle of the party, and I think he felt that he always had people within the party kind of that were wanting to go faster than him and then slower than him. And I think he was comfortable in that position. And I think that's why Hofstadter accuses him of being a follower rather than a leader.
Mm.
But most of the time, that's kind of where you want to be as a leader, unless you're really sure that you can move everybody forward. And
Yeah.
so I mean,
he doesn't have that massive congressional experience. He's not a LBJ. He's not even a Joe Biden, right? Or would you question me on that?
True. No, that's, I think, true. I think even more relevant in a way. I mean, he had a lot of experience as a party politician, so had a good feel for that. He had never been in an executive position.
I mean, he was in the House for like 2 years, right?
Right.
Congressional experience. So
but he'd been in a state legislature, and he'd been a sort of
Congress, though,
party politician. Sure, but they also, the idea that people in Congress stayed for long times, they were rotated out. That's what happened to Lincoln, sort of rotated out. So that was not that unusual. I mean, James Buchanan had a lot of congressional experience and executive experience, didn't do him much good. But I do think people that were in his cabinet, like Seward, who came to admire Lincoln over time, one of his concerns with Lincoln at the beginning was that he really didn't understand what an executive was supposed to do. And especially because Lincoln would have all these people in his office. And to Seward, that didn't seem a very efficient use of your time. And I think Lincoln learned that, actually. He had fewer of those sort of public opinion baths, as he called them. And actually, so he sort of moved.
There's some Obama parallels there, too.
Yeah, but it turned out Lincoln was actually a really good administrator, because he understood the thing that was most important about administrating, which is pick good people and delegate. Unlike his predecessor, James Polk, not the immediate predecessor, but James Polk wanted to do everything himself, and it practically killed him. And he did die right after he left the presidency. Where, of course, Lincoln died in the presidency, but Lincoln, I think, did. I mean, one of the things that I think he did well was he understood what are the things that are most important that I need to work on, and what are the things that I can have other people do. And in fact, this harkens back to the job talk I gave back in 1990. The idea of like letting Salmon Chase do the economic policy, let him take the heat for that. I don't need to deal with that. I'm going to focus on the things that are most important to me. And in that sense, Lincoln is, I think, very unlike Trump.
I mean, there was a question, are there any other resources you would advise for Lincoln stuff? I mean, Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals is a good entry point, I'm sure, but I'm sure you have better recommendations than me.
Yeah, Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals is an interesting book, because at the time I was thinking about writing a book on Lincoln's cabinet.
Oh, so my gosh.
When that came out, I was like, damn.
It's over. Give it up.
The books that I read that I thought were really good, if you actually in the annotated bibliography, because one of the things that the bibliographic essay in the book, one of the things that that series requires is a bibliographic essay. And I'm like, I'm not a Lincoln scholar. How am I supposed to write a bibliographic essay? But one of the books that I found was the book I mentioned earlier, Freedom National. I think that's a fantastic book. And the second half of my book is definitely influenced by it. And James Oakes actually writes the preface for it. I think that's a great book. There's so many good Lincoln books. So I guess what I would say is read the bibliographic essay. And I think you'll find a lot of good Lincoln books there.
Well, I have so appreciated this discussion, and I know that we could probably continue for another hour. We've had some great questions submitted. If we didn't get to your question, don't worry. We will be sharing that with Professor Ellis and Joe, and hopefully they can answer your questions offline. But thank you so much for joining us and for participating this evening. I want to extend my sincere thanks to Professor Ellis for sharing his knowledge and his time, and to Joe for serving as our host. Thank you both again for leading us through this great discussion. And we hope that you as the viewer found this reminiscent of your academic experience here at Willamette. And we look forward to seeing many of you again online for our next Woo stream. But for now, take care, and we hope that you have a great evening.
Thank you so much, everybody.
I felt like I was back in class, so.